Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Gentleman Psychic. Welcome back to Story Time. The clock is just about to strike 10. Good evening, John Maxwell. For those of you who are watching on the Book of Faces, hello, Dean Yoder. Lovely to see you, my friend. I am going to be ending my podcast over here on Facebook, even though it'd be nice if I could restream. And maybe in the future, I just do this setup because the restream thing is a little bit pricey. And I only use it for story times. Well, story time and Scared and Alone. Lauren Morgan Richards, hello, my friend. Lovely to see you, my brother, actually. So also I wanted to say hello to those who are watching on somebody else's computers. Hello, the Lucifer's Girl. Lovely to see you. Hello, everybody. Okay, those of you who are on my Facebook, I am going to end my Facebook feed so I can share the feed for the YouTubes. But anyway, on Facebook, love you all. And thank you for joining me for that little bit of one. Now, for those of you at home, oh, that was not a pretty picture there at the end, but that is okay. Let me go over here and we will share where we are. Let's see. Here we go. Live, share, copy the link. And then we go over here. We'll comment here. Oops.
I can't wait to have this night. And with that,
Come on.
Go ahead and go live right now.
Sorry, everybody. I'm kicking and screaming into the 21st century, and it is not the easiest thing for me to do because I am, I'm 19th century at heart. So here we go. We'll go here, paste it here, and then we'll go over to the Gentleman Psychic. Join me now. And paste. There we go. Okay, lovelies. So many exciting things to tell you. Hello, Mary Jane. Good evening, John Maxwell. Good to see you. Sean Ontario. Hello, hello. So in a couple of days, the voting is going to begin for the Face of Horror. Here comes my clock. Lovely. So in a few days, the voting will begin on Faces of Horror. I will share that on all of the medias of social, and hopefully you will vote for me and you will share it around. That would be splendiferous if you would. What else do I have in the way of announcements? Nothing really, excepting for, as I was telling people on the Facebook, I was out today and a sudden thunderstorm just appeared, and I had to take the carpool lane home because it was definitely very wet. So anyway, my lovelies, that's all I have in the way of announcements, and we are so close to finishing this book. We have just a few more chapters. So, and next week we're going to start a very special one I'm really excited for. It's something a little bit lighter, something that is not quite so scientific. It's not so Latin heavy. So anyway, I hope you will stick around and enjoy that as well. All right, my lovelies. Chapter 14. Oh, I'm sorry, chapter 16. Want of air. Thus around the Nautilus, above and below, was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were prisoners to the iceberg. I watched the captain. His countenance had resumed its habitual imperturbability. Gentlemen, he said calmly, there are two ways of dying in the circumstances in which we are placed. This inexplicable person had the air of a mathematical professor lecturing to his pupils. The first is to be crushed. The second is to die of suffocation. I do not speak of the possibility of dying of hunger, for the supply of provisions in the Nautilus will certainly last longer than we shall. Let us then calculate our chances. As to suffocate, Captain, I replied, that is not to be feared because our reservoirs are full. Just so. But they will only yield 2 days' supply of air. Now, for 36 hours, we have been hidden under the water, and already the heavy atmosphere of the Nautilus has required renewal. In 48 hours, our reserve will be exhausted. Well, Captain, can we be delivered before 48 hours? We will attempt it, at least by piercing the wall that is surrounding us. On which side? Sound will tell us. I am going to run the Nautilus aground in the lower bank, and my men will attack the iceberg on the side that is least thick. Captain Nemo went out. Soon I discovered by hissing noise that the water was entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank slowly and rested on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, the depth at which the lower bank was immersed. My friends, I said, our situation is serious, but I rely on your courage and energy. Sir, replied the Canadian, I am ready to do anything for the general safety. Good, Ned, and I held out my hand to the Canadian. I will add, he countered, that being as handy with the pickaxe as with a harpoon, if I can be useful to the captain, he can command my services. He will not refuse your help. Come, Ned. I led him to the room where the crew of the Nautilus were putting on their cork jackets. I told the captain of Ned's proposal, which he accepted. The Canadian put on his sea costume and was ready as soon as his companions. When Ned was dressed, I re-entered the drawing room, where the panes of glass were open, and posted near counsel, I examined the ambient beds that supported the Nautilus. Some instants after, we saw a dozen of the crew set foot on the bank of ice, and among them Ned Land, easily known by his stature. Captain Nemo was with them, but proceeding to dig the walls, he took the soundings to be sure of working in the right direction. Long sounding lines were sunk in the side walls, but after 15 yards, they were again stopped by the thick wall. It was useless to attack it on the ceiling-like surface, since the iceberg itself measured more than 400 yards in height. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower surface. There, 10 yards of wall separated us from the water. So great was the thickness of the ice field. It was necessary, therefore, to cut from it a piece equal in extent to the water line of the Nautilus. There was about 6,000 cubic yards to detach, so as to dig a hole by which we could descend to the ice field. The work was begun immediately, and carried on with indefatigable energy. Instead of digging round the Nautilus, which would have involved greater difficulty, Captain Nemo had an immense trench made 8 yards from the port quarter. Then the men set to work simultaneously, with their screws on several points of its circumference. Presently, the pickaxe attacked this compact matter vigorously. The large blocks were detached from the mass. By a curious effect of specific gravity, these blocks, lighter than water, fled, so to speak, to the vault of the tunnel that increased the thickness at the top in the proportion as it is diminished at the base. But that mattered little, so long as the lower part grew thinner. After 2 hours' hard work, Ned Land came in exhausted. He and his comrades were replaced by new workers, whom Council and I joined. The second lieutenant of the Nautilus superintended us. The water seemed singularly cold, but I soon got warm handling the pickaxe. My movements were free enough, although they were made under pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I re-entered after working 2 hours to take some food and rest, I found a perceptible difference between the pure fluid with which the rocochial engine supplied me and the atmosphere of the Nautilus already charged with carbonic acid. The air had not been renewed for 48 hours, and its vivifying qualities were considerably enfeebled. However, after a lapse of 12 hours, we had only raised a block of ice 1 yard thick on the marked surface, which was about 600 cubic yards. Reckoning that it took 12 hours to accomplish this much, it would take 5 nights and 4 days to bring this enterprise to a satisfactory conclusion. 5 nights and 4 days. And we have only air enough for 2 days in the reservoirs. Without taking into account, said Ned, that even if we get out of this infernal prison, we shall also be imprisoned under the iceberg, shut out from the possible communication with the atmosphere. True enough, who could then foresee the minimum of the necessary for our deliverance? We might be suffocated before the Nautilus could regain the surface of the waves. Was it destined to perish in this ice tomb, with all those it enclosed? The situation was terrible, but every one had looked at danger in the face, and each was determined to do his duty to the last. As I expected, during the night, a new block 1 yard square was carried away, and still further sank the immense hollow. But in the morning, when dressed in my cork jacket, I traversed the slushy mess at temperatures of 6 or 7 degrees below zero. I remarked that the side walls were gradually closing in, the beds of water furthest from the trench that were not warmed by the men's mere work showed a tendency to solidification. In presence of these new, imminent danger, what would become of our chances of safety, and how hinder the solidification of this liquid medium? What would burst the partitions of the Nautilus like glass? I did not tell my companions of this new danger. What was the good of dampening the energy they displayed in the painful work of escape? But when I went on board again, I told Captain Nemo of the grave complication. I know it, he said, in that calm tone which could counteract the most terrible apprehensions. It is one danger more, but I see no way of escaping it. The only chance of safety is to go quicker than solidification. We must be beforehand with it. That is all. On this day, for several hours, I used my pickaxe vigorously. The work kept me up. Besides, to work was to quit the Nautilus and to breathe directly the pure air drawn from the reservoirs and supplied by our apparatus, and to quit the impoverished and vitiated atmospheres. Toward evening, the trench was dug 1 yard deeper. When I returned on board, I was nearly suffocated by the carbonic acid with which the air was filled. Ah, if we had only the chemical means to drive away this delirious gas! We had plenty of oxygen. All this water contained a considerable quantity, and by dissolving it with our powerful piles, it would restore the vivifying fluid. I had thought well over it, but of what good was that, since the carbonic acid produced by our respiration had invaded every part of the vessel? To absorb it, it was necessary to fill some jars with caustic potash, and to shake them incessantly. This substance was wanting on board, and nothing could replace it. On that evening, Captain Nemo ought to open the taps of the reservoirs and let some pure air into the interior of the Nautilus. Without this precaution, we could not get rid of the sense of suffocation. The next day, March 26th, I resumed my miner's work in the beginning of the 5th yard. The wide walls and the lower surface of the iceberg thickened visibly. It was evident that they would meet before the Nautilus was able to disengage itself. Despair seized me for an instant. My pickaxe nearly fell from my hands. What was the good of digging if I must be suffocated, crushed by the water that was turning into stone? A punishment that the ferocity of the savages even would not have invented. Just then, Captain Nemo passed near me. I touched his hand and showed him the walls of our prison. The wall to port had advanced at least 4 yards from the hull of the Nautilus. The captain understood me and signed to me to follow him. We went on board. I took off my cork jacket and accompanied him into the drawing room. Monsieur Arnaud, we must attempt some desperate means, or we shall be sealed up in this solidified water as it is cement. Yes, but what is to be done? Ah, if my Nautilus were strong enough to bear this pressure without being crushed. Well, I asked, not catching the captain's idea. Do you not understand, he replied, that this congealation of water will help us? Do you not see that, by its solidification, it would burst through this field of ice that imprisons us? When it freezes, it bursts the hardest stones. Do you not perceive that it would be an agent of safety instead of destruction? Yes, Captain, perhaps. But whatever resistance to crushing the Nautilus possesses, it could not support this terrible pressure and would be flattened like an iron plate. I know it, sir. Therefore, we must not reckon on the aid of nature, but on our own exertions. We must stop this solidification. Not only will the side walls be pressed together, but there is not 10 feet of water before or behind the Nautilus. The congealation gains on us on all sides. How long will the air in the reservoirs last for us to breathe on board? The captain looked in my face. After tomorrow, they will be empty. A cold sweat came over me. However ought I to have been astonished at the answer? On March 22nd, the Nautilus was in open polar seas. We were at 26 degrees for 5 days and had lived on the reserve on board. But what was left of the reciprocal air must be kept for the workers even now. As I write, my recollection is still so vivid that an involuntary terror seizes me, and my lungs seem without air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo reflected silently, and evidently an idea had struck him, but he seemed to reject it. At last, these words escaped his lips. "Boiling water," he muttered. "Boiling water?" I cried. "Yes, sir. We are enclosed in a space that is relatively confined. Would not jets of boiling water constantly injected by the pumps raise the temperature in this part and stay the congealation?" "Let us try," I said resolutely. "Let us try, Professor." The thermometer then stood at 7 degrees outside. Captain Nemo took me to the galleys where the vast distillatory machines stood that furnished the drinkable water by evaporation. They filled these with water, and all the electric heat from the piles was thrown through the worms bathed in the liquid. In a few minutes, this water reached the hundreds of degrees. It was directed towards the pumps, while fresh water replaced it in proportion. The heat developed by the troughs was such that cold water drawn up from the sea, after only having gone through the machines, come boiling into the body of the pump. The injection was begun, and 3 hours after, the thermometer marked 6 degrees below zero outside. 1 degree was gained. 2 hours later, the thermometer only marked 4 degrees. "We shall succeed," I said to the captain, after having anxiously watched the result of the operation. "I think," he answered, "that we shall not be crushed. We have no more suffocation to fear. During the night, the temperature of the water rose to 1 degree below zero. The injection could not carry to the higher point, but as the congealation of the sea water produces at least 2 degrees, it was at last reassured against the dangers of solidification. The next day, March 27th, 6 yards of ice had been cleared, 4 yards only remaining to be cleared away. There was yet 48 hours' work. The air could not be renewed in the interior of the Nautilus, and this day would make it worse. An intolerable weight oppressed me. Toward 3 o'clock in the evening, the feeling rose to a violent degree. Yawns dilated my jaws. My lungs panted as they inhaled this burning fluid, which became rarefied more and more. A moral torpor took hold of me. I was powerless, almost unconscious. My brave counsel, though exhibiting the same symptoms and suffering in the same manner, never left me. He took my hand and encouraged me, and I heard him murmur, "Oh, if I could only not breathe, so as to leave more air for my master." Tears came into my eyes on hearing him speak this. If our situation to all was intolerable to the interior, with what haste and gladness would we put on our cork jackets to work in our turn? Pickaxes sounded on the frozen ice beds. Our arms ached. The skin was torn off our hands. But what were those fatigues? What did the wounds matter? Vital air came to the lungs. We breathed. We breathed. At this time, no one prolonged his voluntary task beyond the prescribed time. His task accomplished, each one handed in turn his panting companions and apparatus that supplied him with life. Captain Nemo set the example and submitted first to the severe discipline. When time came, he gave up his apparatus to another and returned to the vitiated air on board, calm, unflinching, unmurmuring. On that day, the ordinary work that accomplished with unusual vigor. Only 2 yards remained to be raised from the surface. 2 yards only separated us from the open sea. But the reservoirs were nearly emptied of air. The little that remained ought to be kept for the workers, not a particle for the Nautilus. When I went back on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I know not how to describe it. The next day, my breathing was oppressed. Dizziness accompanied the pain in my head and made me like a drunken man. My companions showed the same symptoms. Some of the crew had rattling in the throat. On that day, the sixth of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo, finding the pickaxes work too slowly, resolved to crush the ice bed that still separated us from the liquid sheet. This man's coolness and energy never forsook him. He subdued his physical pains by moral force. By his orders, the vessel was lightened. That is to say, raised from the ice bed by a change of specific gravity. When it floated, they towed it as to bring it above the immense trench made on the level of the water line. Then, filling his reservoirs with water, he descended and shut himself up in the hole. Just then, all the crew came on board, and the double door of the communication was shut. The Nautilus then rested on the bed of ice, which was not 1 yard thick, and which its sounding leads had perforated in 1,000 places. The taps of the reservoirs were then opened, and 100 cubic yards of water was let in, increasing the weight of the Nautilus to 1,800 tons. We waited, we listened, forgetting our sufferings in hope. Our safety depended on this last chance, notwithstanding the buzzing in my head. I soon heard the humming sound under the hull of the Nautilus. The ice cracked with a singular noise like tearing paper, and the Nautilus sank. "We are off," murmured counsel in my ear. I could not answer him. I seized his hand and pressed it convulsively. All at once, carried away by its frightful overcharge, the Nautilus sank like a bullet under the waters. That is to say, it fell as if it was in a vacuum. Then all the electric force was put on the pumps that soon began to let the water out of the reservoirs. After some minutes, our fall was stopped. Seas 2, the manometer indicated an ascending movement. The screw, going at full speed, made the iron hull tremble to its very bolts, and drew us toward the north. But if this floating under the iceberg is to last another day before we reach the open sea, I shall be dead first. Half stretched upon a divan in the library, I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, my faculties suspended. I neither saw nor heard. All notion of time had gone from my mind. My muscles could not contract. I do not know how many hours passed thus, but I was conscious of the agony that was coming over me. I felt as if I was going to die. Suddenly, I came to. Some breaths of air penetrated my lungs. Had we risen to the surface of the waves? Were we free of the iceberg? No, Ned and Council, my two brave friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. Some particles of air still remained at the bottom of one apparatus. Instead of using it, they had kept it for me, and while they were being suffocated, they gave me life drop by drop. I wanted to push back the thing. They held my hands, and for some moments I breathed freely. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It ought to be the 28th of March. The Nautilus went at a frightful pace, 40 miles an hour. It literally tore through the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he succumbed? Were his companions dead with him? At the moment, the manometer indicated we were not more than 20 feet from the surface. A mere plate of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we not break it? Perhaps, in any case, the Nautilus was going to attempt it. I felt that it was in an oblique position, lowering the stern and raising the bows. The introduction of water had been the means of disturbing its equilibrium. Then, impelled by its powerful screw, it attacked the ice field from beneath like a formidable battering ram. It broke it backing end, then rushing forward against the field, which gradually gave way, and at last, dashing suddenly against it, shot forward on the icy field and crushed beneath its weight. The panel was opened, one might say torn off, and the pure air came in the abundance to all parts of the Nautilus. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got to the platform, I have no idea. Perhaps the Canadian had carried me there, but I breathed, I inhaled the vivifying sea air. My two companions were getting drunk with the fresh particles. The other unhappy men had been so long without food that they could not, with punity, indulge the simplest ailments that were given them. We, on the contrary, had no need to restrain ourselves. We could draw this air freely into our lungs, and it was the breeze alone that filled us with this keen enjoyment. Ah, said Council, how delightful this oxygen is. Master need not fear to breathe it. There is enough for everybody. Ned Land did not speak, but he opened his jaws wide enough to frighten a shark. Our strength soon returned, and when I looked round me, I saw we were alone on the platform. The foreign seamen in the Nautilus were contented with the air circulated in the interior. None of them had to come drink in the open air. The first words I spoke were words of gratitude and thankfulness to my two companions. Ned and Council had prolonged my life during the last hours of this long agony. All my gratitude could not repay such devotion. My friends, said I, we are bound one to the other forever, and I am under infinite obligations to you. which I shall take advantage of, exclaimed the Canadian. What do you mean? Said Council. I mean that I shall take you with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus. Well, said Council, after all this, we are going, right? Yes, I replied, for we are going the way of the sun, and here the sun is in the north. No doubt, said Ned Land, but it remains to be seen whether he will bring the ship into the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, that is, into frequented or deserted seas. I could not answer that question, and feared that Captain Nemo would rather take us to the vast ocean that touches the coasts of Asia and America. At the same time, he would thus complete the tour round the submarine world and return to those waters in which the Nautilus could sail freely. We ought before long to settle this important point. The Nautilus went at a rapid pace. The polar circle was soon passed, and the course shaped for Cape Horn. We were off the American point, March 31st at 7 o'clock in the evening. Then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The remembrance of that imprisonment in the ice was effaced from our minds. We only thought of the future. Captain Nemo did not appear again, either in the drawing room or on the platform. The point shown each day on the planisphere and marked by the lieutenant showed me the exact direction of the Nautilus. Now, on that evening, it was evident that to my great satisfaction, that we were going back to the north by the Atlantic. The next day, 1st of April, when the Nautilus ascended to the surface some minutes before noon, we sighted land to the west. It was Terra del Fuego, which the first navigators named thus from seeing a quantity of smoke that rose from the native huts. The coast seemed low to me, but in the distance rose high mountains. I even thought I had a glimpse of Mount Saramento, that rises 2,070 yards above the level of the sea, with a very pointed summit, which according as it is misty or clear, is a sign of fine or wet weather. At this moment, the peak was clearly defined against the sky. The Nautilus, diving again under the water, approached the coast, which was only some few miles off. From the glass windows in the drawing room, I saw long seaweeds and gigantic fuci, and varick, of which the open polar sea contained so many specimens. With their sharp, polished filaments, they measured about 300 yards in length, real cables thicker than one's thumb, and having great tenacity, they are often used as rope for vessels. Another weed, known as velp, with leaves 4 feet long, buried in the coral concretions, hung at the bottom. It served as a nest of food for myriads of crustacea and mollusks, crabs, and cuttlefish. There, seals and otters had splendid repasts, eating the flesh of fish with sea vegetables, according to the English fashion. Over this fertile and luxuriant ground, the Nautilus passed with great rapidity. Toward evening, it approached the Falkland group, the rough summits of which I recognized the following day. The depth of the sea was moderate. On the shores, our nets brought in beautiful specimens of seaweed, and particularly a certain fucus, the roots of which were filled with the best mussels in the world. Geese and ducks fell by dozens on the platform, and soon took their place on the pantry on board. With regard to fish, I observed especially specimens of the goby species, some 2 feet long, all over white and yellow spots. I admired also numerous medusae, and the finest of the sort, the chrysora, peculiar to the sea about the Falkland Islands. I should have liked to preserve some specimens of the delicate zoophytes, but they only like cloudy shadows, apparitions that sink and evaporate when out of their native element. When the last heights of the Falklands had disappeared from the horizon, the Nautilus sank between 20 and 25 yards and followed the American coast. Captain Nemo did not show himself until the 3rd day of April. We did not quit the shores of Patagonia. Sometime under the ocean, sometimes at the surface, the Nautilus passed beyond large estuary formed by the mouth of the Plata, and was, on the 4th of April, 56 miles off Uruguay. Its direction was northward, and followed the long windings of the coast of South America. We had then made 16,000 miles since our embarkation in the Sea of Japan. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the Tropic of Capricorn was crossed on the 37th meridian, and we passed Cape Frio, standing out to sea. Captain Nemo and Ned Land's great displeasure did not like the neighborhood of the inhabited coasts of Brazil, for we went at giddy speed. Not a fish, not a bird of the swiftest kind could follow us, and the natural curiosities of these seas escaped all observation. This speed was kept up for several days, and in the evening of the 9th of April, we sighted the most easterly point of South America that forms Cape San Roque. But then the Nautilus swerved again and sought the lowest depths of the submarine valley, which is between the Cape and the Sierra Leone on the African coast. This valley bifurcates to a parallel of the Nautilus and terminates at the north by an enormous depression of 9,000 yards. In this place, the geographical basin of the ocean forms, as far as the Lesser Antilles, a cliff of 3.5 miles perpendicular in height, and, at a parallel of the Cape Verde Islands, another wall not less considerable that encloses thus all the sunk continent of the Atlantic. The bottom of this immense valley is dotted with some mountains that give to these submarine places a picturesque aspect. I speak, moreover, from the manuscript charts that were in the library of the Nautilus, charts evidently due to the Captain Nemo's hand and made after his personal observations. For 2 days, the desert and the deep waters were visited by means of the inclined planes. The Nautilus was furnished with long diagonal broadsides which carried it to all elevations, but on the 11th of April it rose suddenly and land appeared at the mouth of the Amazon River, a vast estuary, the embouchure of which is so considerable that it freshens the sea water for a distance of several leagues. The equator was crossed. 20 miles to the west were the Guineas, a French territory on which we could have found an easy refuge, but a stiff breeze was blowing, and the furious waves would not have allowed a single boat to face them. Ned Land understood that, no doubt, for to face them, for he spoke not a word about it. For my part, I made no allusion to his schemes of flight, for I would not argue him to make an attempt that must inevitably fail. I made the time pass pleasantly by interesting studies. During the days of April 11th and 12th, the Nautilus did not leave the surface of the sea, and the net brought in a marvelous haul of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes had been fished up by the chain of the nets. They were the most part beautiful phylactines belonging to the Antecidian family, and among other species, the Phylactyles protextia, peculiar to the part of the ocean, with a little cylindrical trunk ornamented with vertical lines, speckled with red dots, crowning the marvelous blossoming of tentacles. As to the mollusks, they consisted of some I had already observed, Turtellas, olive peripheries with regular lines intercrossed with red spots standing out plainly against the flesh, odd petricaris like petrified scorpions, translucid azaleas, argonauts, cuttlefish, excellent eating, and certain species of calamars that naturalists of antiquity have classed among the flying fish. that serve principally for bait for cod fishing. I had not an opportunity of studying several species of fish on these shores. Among the cartilaginous ones, Petromovision's prica, a sort of eel, 15 inches long, with a greenish head, violet fins, gray blue back, brown belly, silvered and sewn with bright spots, the pupil of the eye encircled with gold, a curious animal that the current of the Amazon had drawn to the sea, for they inhabited fresh waters, tuberculated streaks, which with pointed snouts and long loose tails, armed with a long jagged sting, little sharks a yard long, gray and whitish skin, and several rows of teeth bent back that are generally known by the name of pantophiles vespertilos, a kind of red isosceles triangle, half a yard long, to which portals are attached by fleshy prolongations that make them like bats. But their horny appendage, situated near the nostrils, has given them the name of sea unicorns. Lastly, some species of ballistae and curacervarian, whose spots were at the brilliant gold color, and the capricious of the clear violet, with varying shades like a pigeon's throat. I end here this catalogue, which is somewhat dry, perhaps, but very exact, with the series of a bony fish that I observed in passing, belonging to the Aphrotonotes, and whose snout is white as snow, the body of the beautiful black marked with very long, loose, fleshy strip, Odonthongethes, armed with spikes, sardines 9 inches long, glittering with bright silver light, a species of mackerel provided with two anal fins, Cenornotes of blackish tint that are fished with the torches, long fish 2 yards in length, with fat flesh, white and firm, which, when they are fresh, taste like eel, and when dry, like smoked salmon. Labries, half red, covered with scales, only at the bottom of the dorsal and anal fins. Christopheria, on which gold and silver blend their brightness with that of the ruby and the topaz, golden-tailed spares, the flesh of which is extremely delicate, and whose phosphorescent properties betray them. In the midst of the waters, orange-colored spares with long tongue, marriages with gold caudal fins, dark thorn tails, and plebs of Suriname, etc. Boy, he goes on when he said he wasn't going to. Notwithstanding this etc., I must not omit the mention that mention fish that council will long remember, and with good reason. One of our nets had hauled up a sort of very flat rayfish, which, with the tail cut off, formed the perfect disc and weighed 20 ounces. It was white underneath and red above, with large round spots of dark blue encircled with black, very glossy skin, terminating in a bilobed fin laid out on the platform. It struggled, tried to turn itself by convulsive movements, and made so many efforts that one last turn had nearly sent it into the sea. But Council was not wishing to let the fish go, rushed to it, and, before I could prevent him, had seized it with both hands. In a moment, he was overthrown, his legs in the air and half his body paralyzed, crying, "Oh, master, master, come to me." It was the first time the poor boy had not spoken to me in third person. The Canadian and I took him up and rubbed his contracted arms till he became sensible. The unfortunate Council had attacked a crampfish of the most dangerous kind. The Kamana, this odd animal and a medium conductor like water, strikes fish at several yards distance, so great as the power of electric organ, the two principal surface of which do not measure less than 27 square feet. The next day, April 12th, the Nautilus approached the Dutch coast near the mouth of the Moroni. The several groups of sea cows herded together. They were manatees that, like the dugong and the stellars, belonged to the Sirenian order. These beautiful animals, peaceable and inoffensive, from 18 to 21 feet in length, weigh at least 1,600 weight. I told Ned Land and Council that provident nature had assigned an important role to these mammals. Indeed, they, like seals, are designed to graze on the submarine prairies and thus destroy the accumulation of weed that obstructs the tropical rivers. And you know, I added, what has been the result since men have almost entirely annihilated this useful race? That the putrefied weeds have poisoned the air, and the poisoned air causes the yellow fever. That dilates these beautiful countries. Enormous vegetations are multiplied under the torrid seas, and the evil is irresistibly developed from the mouth of the Rio de la Plata to Florida. If we are to believe Towsonel, this plague is nothing to what it would be if the seas were cleared of whales and seas. Then, instead with polyps, medusae, and cuttlefish, they would become immense centers of infection, since their waves would not possess these vast stomachs that God had charged to infest the surface of the seas. However, without disputing these theories, the crew of the Nautilus took possession of half a dozen manatees. They provisioned the larders with excellent flesh, superior to beef and veal. This sport was not interesting. The manatees allowed themselves to be hit without defending themselves. Several thousand pounds of meat were stored upon board to be dried. On this day, a successful haul of fish increased the stores of the Nautilus, so full of game were these seas. They were Echinids belonging to the third family of the Malatecaphrygians. Their flattened discs were composed of transverse movable cartilaginous plates by which the animal was enabled to create a vacuum and so to adhere to any object like a cupping glass. The remora that I observed in the Mediterranean belongs to this species, but the one of which we are speaking was the Enchisis ostracera, peculiar to this sea. The fishing over, the Nautilus neared the coast. About here, a number of sea turtles were sleeping on the surface of the water. They would have been difficult to capture, these precious reptiles, for the least noise awakens them, and their solid skull is proof against the harpoon. But the Echinines effects their capture with extraordinary precaution and certainty. This animal is, indeed, a living fishhook, which would make the fortune of an inexperienced fisherman. The crew of the Nautilus tied a ring to the tail of these fish, so large as to not encumber their movements, and to this ring a long cord, lashed to the ship's side by the other end. The Echinids thrown into the sea directly began their game. They fixed themselves to the breastplate of the turtle, their tenacity as such that they were torn rather than to let go of their hold. The men hauled them on board, and with the turtles, and with them the turtles to which they adhered. They took also several cautionous a yard long, which weighed 400 pounds. Their caprice covered with large horny plates, thin, transparent, brown with white and yellow spots, fetch a good price in the market. Besides, they were excellent in the edible point of view, as well as fresh turtles, which have an exquisite flavor. This day's fishing brought to a close our stay on the shores of the Amazon, and by nightfall the Nautilus had regained the high seas. I think, my darlings, that should be where we end for the night. I don't want to get into a chapter and have the time go off. I can't even see the clock. Oh, you know what? Let's continue. We've got 10 minutes. Chapter 18, The Polyps. For several days, the Nautilus kept off the seas of the American coast. Evidently, it did not wish to risk the tides of the Gulf of Mexico or the Sea of the Antilles. April 16th, we sighted Martinique and the Guadeloupe from the distance of about 30 miles. I saw their tall peaks for an instant. The Canadian, who counted on carrying out his projects in the Gulf by either landing or hailing one of the numerous boats that coast from island to another, was quite disheartened. Flight would have been quite practical if Ned Land had been able to take possession of the boat without the captain's knowledge, but in the open sea it could not be thought of. The Canadian, Council, and I had a long conversation on this subject. For 6 months, we had been prisoners on board the Nautilus. We had traveled 17,000 leagues, and as Ned Land said, there was no reason why it should not come to an end. We could hope nothing from the captain of the Nautilus, but only from ourselves. Besides, for some time past, we had become graver, more retired, less sociable. He seemed to shun me. I met him rarely. Formerly, he was pleased to explain the submarine marvels to me. Now he left me to my studies and came no more to the saloon. What change had come over him? For what cause, for my part, I did not wish to bury with me my curious and novel studies. I had now the power to write the true book of the sea, and this book, sooner or later, I wished to see daylight. Then again, in the water of the Antilles, 10 yards below the surface of the water, by the open panels, what interesting products I had to enter in my daily notes. There were, among other zoophytes, those known under the names of Fealis pelagacea, a sort of large oblong bladder with mother-of-pearl-shaped rays holding out their membranes to the wind and letting their blue tentacles float like threads of silk. Charming medusae to the eye, real nettles to the touch, that distill a corrosive fluid. They were also annelids, a yard and a half long, furnished with a pink horn and with 1,700 locomotive organs that wind through the waters and throw out in passing all the light of the solar spectrum. They were, in the fish category, some Malabar rays, enormous gristly things, 10 feet long, weighing 600 pounds, the pectoral fin triangular in the midst of the slightly humped back, the eyes fixed in the extremities of the face beyond the head, and which floated like weft and looked sometimes like opaque shutter on our glass window. There were American ballistae, which nature has only dressed in black and white, gobies with yellow fins and prominent jaw, mackerel 16 feet long with short pointed teeth covered with small scales belonging to the albacore species. Then in swarms appeared gray mullet covered with stripes of gold from the head to the tail, beating their resplendent fins like masterpieces of jewelry. Concentrated formerly to Diana, particularly sought after by rich Romans, and of which the proverb says, "Whoever takes them does not eat them." Lastly, Pomacanthiae dorsii, ornamented the emerald bands, dressed in velvet and silk, passed before our eyes like Veronese lords, spurred spari, passed with the pectoral fins, Clupodons 15 inches long, enveloped in their phosphorescent light. Mullet beat the sea with their large jagged tails. Red vanduses seemed to mow the waves with their showy pectoral fins. The silvery salines, worthy of their name, rose on the horizon of the waters like so many moons with whitish rays. April 20th. We had risen to a mean height of 1,500 yards. The land nearest us was the archipelago of the Bahamas. There rose high submarine cliffs covered with large weeds, giant laminary and fuci, a perfect espalier of hydrophytes worthy of the Titan world. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to formidable pricking like sting of an ant, which was produced by means of large seaweeds. Well, I said, there are proper caverns for polyps, and I should not be astonished to see some of these monsters. What? Said Council. Cuttlefish, real cuttlefish of the cephalopod class? No, said I. Polyps of huge dimensions. I will never believe that such animals exist, said Ned. Well, said Council, with the most serious air in the world, I remember perfectly to have seen large vessel drawn under the waves by a cephalopod arm. You saw what? Said the Canadian. Yes, Ned. With your own eyes? With my own eyes. Where, pray, might that be? At St. Malo, answered Council. In the port? Said Ned ironically. No. In a church, replied Council. In a church? Cried the Canadian. Yes, friend Ned. In the picture representing the polyp in question. Good, said Ned Land, bursting out laughing. He's quite right, I said. I have heard of this picture, but the subject represented is taken from the legend, and you know what to think of legends in the matter of natural history. Besides, when it was a question of monsters, the imagination is apt to run wild. Not only is it supposed that these polyps can draw down vessel, but certain Olphus Magnus speaks of a cephalopod a mile long that is more like an island than an animal. It is also said that Bishop of Nidros was building an altar on the immense rock. Mass finished, the rock began to walk and returned to the sea. The rock was a polyp. Another bishop, Pontapidian, speaks also of a polyp on which a regiment of cavalry could maneuver. Lastly, the ancient naturalists speak of monsters whose mouths were like gulfs, and which were too large to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. But how much is true of these stories? Asked Council. Nothing, my friend. At last, of that which passes the limit of the truth to get fable or legend. Nevertheless, there must be some ground for the imagination of the storytellers. One cannot deny that polyps and cuttlefish exist of large species. Inferior, however, to the cetaceans, Aristotle has stated the dimensions of the cuttlefish as 5 cubits or 9 feet 2 inches. Our fishermen frequently see some of that are more than 4 feet long. Some skeletons of polyps are preserved in the museums of Trieste and Montpellier that measure 2 yards in length. Besides, according to the calculations of some naturalists, one of these animals, only 6 feet long, would have tentacles 27 feet long. That would suffice to make a formidable monster. Do they fish for them in these days? Asked Ned. If they do not fish for them, sailors see them at least. One of my friends, Captain Paul Boss of Harvey, was often affirmed that he met one of these monsters of colossal dimensions in the Indian seas. But the most astonishing fact, and which does not permit of the denial of the existence of these gigantic animals, happened some years ago in 1861. What is the fact? Asked Ned Land. This is that in 1861, to the northeast of the Ternate, very nearly in the same latitude we are in now, the crew of the dispatch boat Elector perceived the monstrous cuttlefish swimming in the waters. Captain Bouget went near to the animal and attacked it with harpoons and guns without much success. For balls and harpoons glided over the soft flesh. After several fruitless attempts, the crew tried to pass a slip knot round the body of the mollusks. The noose slipped as far as the caudal fins and there stopped. They tried them to haul it on board, but weight was so considerable that the tightness of the cord separated the tail from the body, and deprived of this ornament, he disappeared under the water. Indeed, is that a fact? As indisputable fact, my good Ned, they proposed and named this polyp Bouget's cuttlefish. What length was it? Asked the Canadian. Did it not measure about 6 yards? Said Counsel, who posted at the window was examining again the irregular windings of the cliff. Precisely, I replied. Its head, rejoined Counsel, was it not crowned with 8 tentacles that beat the water like the nest of serpents? Precisely. Had not its eyes placed at the back of its head considerable development? Yes, Counsel. And was it not its mouth like parrot's beak? Exactly, Counsel. Very well. No offense to master, he replied quietly. This is not Bouget's cuttlefish. It is, at least, one of its brothers. I looked at Counsel. Ned Land hurried to the window. What a horrible beast, he cried. I looked in my turn and could not repress a gesture of disgust. Before my eyes was a horrible monster worthy to figure in the legends of the marvelous. It was an immense cuttlefish, being 8 yards long, and it swam in crossways in the directions of the Nautilus with great speed, watching us with its enormous, staring green eyes. Its 8 arms, or rather feet, fixed to its head, but that having given the name of a cephalopod to these animals, were twice as long as its body, and were twisted like furry's hair. One could see the 250 air holes on the inner side of the tentacles. The monster's mouth, a horned beak like a parrot's, opened and shut vertically. Its tongue, a horned substance furnished with several rows of pointed teeth, came out quivering from its veritable pair of shears. What a freak of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk, its spindle-like body formed a fleshy mass that might have weighed 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. The varying color changing with great rapidity according to the irritation of the animal, passed successively from livid gray to reddish brown. What irritated this mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, more formidable than itself, and on which its suckers or its jaws had no hold. We're almost there. Yet, what monsters these polyps are! What vitality the Creator had given them! What vigor in their movement! And they possessed 3 hearts. Chance had brought us in presence of this cuttlefish, and I did not wish to lose the opportunity of carefully studying this specimen of cephalopods. I overcame the horror that inspired me, and taking a pencil, began to draw it. Perhaps this is the same which the elector saw, said the Counsel. No, replied the Canadian, for this is a whole, and the other had lost its tail. That is no reason, I replied. The arms and tails of these animals are reformed by regeneration, but that's not how it's spelled here. Reformed by regeneration, and in seven years, the tail of Bouget's cuttlefish has no doubt had time to grow. But by this time, other polyps appeared at the port light. I counted 7. They formed a procession after the Nautilus, and I heard their beaks gnashing against the iron hull. I continued my work. These monsters kept in the water their such precision they had seemed immovable. Suddenly, the Nautilus stopped. A shock made it tremble in every plate. Have we struck anything? I asked. In any case, replied the Canadian, we shall be free, for we are floating. The Nautilus was floating, no doubt, but it did not move a minute past. Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, entered the drawing room. I had not seen him for some time. He seemed dull, without noticing or speaking to us. He went to the panel, looked at the polyps, and said something to his lieutenant. The latter went out. Soon the panels were shut. The ceiling was lighted. I went towards the captain. A curious collection of polyps, I said. Yes, indeed, Mr. Naturalist, he replied, and we are going to fight them, man to beast. I looked at him. I thought I had not heard him aright. Man to beast, I repeated. Yes, sir. The screw is stopped. I think that the horny jaw of one of the cuttlefish is entangled in the blades. That is what prevents our moving. What are we going to do? Rise to the surface and slaughter this vermin? A difficult enterprise. Yes, indeed. The electric bullets are powerless against the soft flesh. Where they do not find resistance enough to go off, but they shall attack them with the hatchet and the harpoon, sir, said the Canadian. If you do not refuse my help, I will accept it, Master Land. We will follow you, I said, and following the Captain Nemo, we went toward the central staircase. There, about 10 men with boarding hatches were ready for the attack. Council and I took 2 hatchets. Ned Land seized a harpoon. The Nautilus had then risen to the surface. One of the sailors, posted to the top of the ladders, unscrewed the bolts of the panels. But hardly were the screws loosened when the panel rose with great violence, evidently drawn by the suckers of the polyp's arm. Immediately, one of these arms slid like a serpent down the opening, and 20 others were above. With one blow of the axe, Captain Nemo cut this formidable tentacle that slid wriggling down the ladder. Just as we were pressing one on the other to reach the platform, 2 other arms lashing the air came down on the seaman placed before Captain Nemo and lifted him with irresistible power. Captain Nemo uttered a cry and rushed out. He hurried after him. What a scene! The unhappy man, seized by the tentacle and fixed to the suckers, was balanced in the air at the caprice of an enormous trunk. He rattled in his throat. He was stifled. He cried, "Help! Help!" These words, spoken in French, startled me. I had a fellow countryman on board, perhaps several, that heartening cry, "I shall hear it all my life." The unfortunate man was lost. Who could rescue him from the powerful pressure? However, Captain Nemo had rushed to the polyp, and with one blow of the axe had cut through one arm. His lieutenant struggled furiously against other monsters that crept on the flanks of the Nautilus. The crew fought with their axes. The Canadian, Council, and I buried our weapons in the fleshy masses. A strong smell of musk penetrated the atmosphere. It was horrible. For one instant, I thought the unhappy man entangled with the polyp would be torn from it the powerful suction. 7 of 8 arms had been cut off. Only one wriggled in the air, brandishing the victim like a feather. But just as Captain Nemo and his lieutenant threw themselves on it, the animal ejected the steam of black liquid. They were blinded with it. Then, when clouds dispersed, the cuttlefish had disappeared, and my unfortunate countryman with it. 10 or 12 polyps now invaded the platform. The sides of the Nautilus were rolled pell-mell into the midst of the nets of the serpents that wriggled on the platform in the waves of blood and ink. It seemed as though the slimy tentacles sprang up like the hydra heads. Ned Land's harpoon at each stroke was plunged into the staring eyes of the cuttlefish, but my bold companion was suddenly overturned by the tentacles of the monster he had not been able to avoid. Ah, how my heart beat with emotion and horror! The formidable beak of the cuttlefish was open over Ned Land. The unhappy man would be cut in two. I rushed to his success. His suc- I rushed to his succor, but Captain Nemo was before me. His axe dispersed between the two of the enormous jaws and miraculously saved the Canadian. Rising, plunged his harpoon deep into the triple heart of the polyp. I owed myself this revenge, said the captain to the Canadian. Ned bowed without replying. The combat had lasted a quarter of an hour, the monsters vanquished, and, mutilated, left us at last and disappeared under the waves. Captain Nemo, covered with blood, nearly exhausted, gazed upon the sea that swallowed up one of his companions, and great tears gathered in his eyes. That's where we are, my darlings. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Thank you, those who are joining now, those who are joining in the future, those who are joining on somebody else's computer. You are all special to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I so appreciate each and every one of you. And with that, my lovelies, I bid you a good morning, good evening, and a good night.